Minnesota-Dakota frontier, October 1886. While his neighbors raced to chink their log cabins before the snow flew, one French-Canadian ex-voyageur was still outside at dawn, stringing chalk lines 12 inches from his cabin walls and driving 8-inch tamarack posts into the frozen ground. His neighbors called it building a fort around his house. They laughed at the waste. Why spend 8 days and $6 building a wall fence when everyone knew tight chinking and good mud daubing kept the cold out? He packed 12 inches of clay and moss between his vertical posts, while they finished their cabins in 3 weeks with standard 6-inch logs. Then December arrived. The great die-up winter hit. Sustained winds 20 to 35 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to 20 below, then 40 below zero. Standard cabins failed. Families woke to ice forming on their interior walls 3 feet from the fireplace. But that wall fence, it kept his cabin running 24 degrees warmer than his neighbor's cabin using the exact same amount of firewood. What did this ex-voyageur understand about wind, heat loss, and continuous air sealing that frontier logic completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The first neighbors arrived before full daylight, drawn by the sound of the auger biting into frozen earth. They found Pierre Lacroix stringing a chalk line exactly 12 inches from his cabin's north wall, marking holes with mathematical precision every 12 inches along the perimeter. The October morning was sharp enough to frost breath, but Lacroix worked in shirt sleeves, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Behind him lay a neat pile of tamarack posts, each 7 to 8 inches in diameter, each cut to 8 feet 6 inches and peeled clean of bark. "Expecting Sioux arrows, Pierre?" called out Henrik Olsen, the Norwegian stockman whose own cabin sat a quarter-mile south. "Or maybe ghosts need keeping out?" The joke drew chuckles from the small crowd gathering to watch this curiosity unfold. Word traveled fast in a settlement of fewer than 30 families, and Pierre Lacroix building something that looked suspiciously like a fort around his perfectly good cabin was news worth witnessing. Lacroix paused in his work long enough to tip his wool cap. "Just keeping the wind honest, Henrik." He resumed boring his pilot holes, each one exactly 30 inches deep, measured twice with a marked stick. The neighbors exchanged glances that said what frontier politeness wouldn't. The French-Canadian had finally lost his mind. The conventional wisdom was ironclad and proven by generations of frontier experience. A proper cabin meant horizontal logs, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, scribed tight and chinked with moss and mud daubing. Lincoln himself had built this way, and every settler worth his salt knew that if you couldn't see daylight through your chinking, your cabin was tight enough. Fuel was cheap, prairie hay for the cutting, deadfall timber in every creek bottom, oak and cottonwood for the hauling. Labor was dear, and time was everything. A smart man got his walls up in 3 weeks, spent his remaining energy on barns and fencing, and burned a cord to a cord and a half per month through the cold season like everyone else. But Pierre Lacroix had different mathematics in his head, learned during 15 years moving freight along the Red River cart routes and wintering at trading posts from Prairie du Chien to Fort Snelling. He had seen Poteaux-en-terre construction at French colonial settlements, vertical posts set tight in the earth, horizontal wales binding them together, and the gaps between filled with clay and moss, or clay and chopped straw. He had slept warm in palisaded storehouses while horizontal log cabins drafted like sieves in the same wind. He knew what happened when prairie gusts found every seam in stacked timber, and he had no intention of shivering through another Dakota winter for want of proper wind deflection. The work took shape with methodical precision. Each tamarack post went into its augured hole exactly 30 to 36 inches deep, depending on the frost line, and was tamped solid with clay and stone. The posts stood 12 inches from the existing cabin wall on all sides, creating a uniform gap that would become the heart of his thermal system. At the tops, he lashed willow wales horizontally, then spiked a 2-inch plank cap that would shed water from the infill below. His neighbors continued their commentary as the palisade grew. Looks like he's fixing to stand off a siege, observed Thomas Müller, the German-Russian farmer who ran cattle on the section east of town. That's a powerful lot of work for something that ain't broke. The township road overseer, a Yankee named Samuel Foster, whose own cabin boasted the tightest chinking for miles around, shook his head at the waist. Count them posts, boys. That's 8 days' labor minimum, plus $6.40 in nails and lime and wagon hire. For what? His cabin was snug enough before. But Lacroix had his own accounting system. The gap between posts and cabin wall would be hand-packed in lifts, 2 parts clay loam to 1 part dry moss, tamped to refusal until it rang solid under the ram. Each lift would be 3 to 4 inches thick, built up slowly to prevent settling. The mathematics of thermal resistance were beyond frontier vocabulary, but Lacroix understood that 12 inches of packed earth and moss would slow heat loss far better than a single thickness of logs, no matter how tight the chinking appeared. The infill work began on day 4, and this was where skepticism turned to open mockery. Lacroix hauled clay from the creek bottom and gathered moss from the oak. Groves, mixing them in precise proportions and packing them between his posts with a wooden ram. The work was tedious, methodical, and utterly foreign to men accustomed to building with speed and getting on to the next task. Mud-daubing the outside of a cabin that's already mud-daubed, muttered Henrik Olsen. Frenchman's lost his mind for certain. The openings around doors and windows required special attention. Lacroix formed U-shaped plank bucks that created neat returns, leaving a 1-inch expansion gap that he stuffed with dry moss before overtroweling with clay. Every detail served a purpose learned from years of watching how weather found its way into buildings and how continuous barriers defeated weather more effectively than patched repairs. On day 7, he mixed his lime sand wash in a ratio of 1 part lime to 3 parts sand, adding just enough water to create a paste that would brush on smooth. This exterior coat would shed rain and bind the surface, preventing the clay moss pack from eroding under weather. Around the entire perimeter, he laid an 18-inch gravel skirt sloped at half an inch per foot to carry water away from the foundation line. By day 8, the work was complete. The finished structure looked like exactly what the neighbors had said, a wall fence around a cabin, built by a man who had more time than sense. Pierre Lacroix hung a spirit thermometer 5 feet above his cabin floor and noted the date, October 28, 1886. His neighbor Samuel Foster hung an identical thermometer in his own cabin, partly from scientific curiosity and partly to document just how little difference all this foolishness would make. The first real test came in early November, when a norther brought sustained 20-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures that dropped to 10 degrees above zero. At dawn, with banked coals in both fireplaces, Foster's cabin registered 38 degrees. Lacroix's modified cabin held at 56 degrees. Foster checked his thermometer twice, certain it was reading false. The temperature differential that morning was impossible to ignore, but Samuel Foster needed proof beyond a single reading. He began keeping detailed records, noting wind direction, outside temperature, fuel consumption, and interior readings at dawn when both cabins had been burning banked fires through the night. What he documented over the following weeks painted a picture that challenged everything he thought he knew about cabin construction and heat retention. Standard frontier cabins, built the way every sensible man built them, showed predictable performance patterns. On a typical November morning with outside temperatures at 0 degrees and winds running 15 to 20 miles per hour, Foster's cabin registered between 38 and 42 degrees at dawn. His neighbors reported similar numbers. The variation depended on wind direction and fuel load, but the pattern held consistent across the settlement. These were cabins built by experienced men who knew their trade, logs scribed tight, chinking packed solid, mud daubing applied thick and maintained annually, but the numbers told only part of the story. Foster began testing for air infiltration using candle flames, moving the lit candle along his walls and watching for deflection that would indicate draft. Near the sill line where horizontal logs met the foundation stones, candle flames leaned more than 30 degrees, revealing air movement that felt minimal to a man bundled in wool, but represented massive heat loss when multiplied across hundreds of feet of wall seams. Even more troubling, frost feathers appeared on interior chinking when outside temperatures reached 25 degrees below zero, proof that the thermal barrier was failing exactly where it needed to work hardest. Floor temperatures presented another revelation that Foster had never thought to measure. He placed a thermometer 3 inches above his plank floor near the outside wall and discovered readings of 31 to 34 degrees when the room air measured 40 degrees. His feet had always been cold in winter, but he had attributed this to normal cabin living, not to a fundamental flaw in horizontal log construction that created a thermal bridge conducting cold directly through the wall structure to the interior floor. The mechanisms behind Pierre Lacroix's success became clearer as Foster studied the modified cabin through increasingly harsh November weather. The vertical post system functioned like a fence that split and deflected wind before it could strike the original cabin walls. When 30-mile-per-hour gusts hit Foster's horizontal logs directly, they found every tiny gap in the chinking and drove cold air into the interior through capillary action and pressure differential. The same wind hitting Lacroix's outer palisade lost much of its force in the 12-inch gap, arriving at the inner cabin walls as gentle currents rather than driving pressure. Air sealing represented the most significant difference between the two systems. Horizontal logs, no matter how carefully scribed, created long seam lines where timber met timber along the entire length of each wall. Seasonal shrinkage opened these seams incrementally, and while careful maintenance could reduce the problem, it could never eliminate it entirely. Lacroix's vertical posts, packed with continuous earth and moss, had no long horizontal seams to fail. The entire 12-inch barrier formed a monolithic shell that moved as one unit, expanding and contracting uniformly rather than opening discrete gaps. The thermal barrier itself performed beyond what frontier common sense suggested possible. 12 inches of packed earth and moss created a thermal lag that smoothed temperature swings and reduced heat loss through conduction. While Foster's cabin walls transmitted cold directly from outside air to interior surfaces, Lacroix's walls absorbed and stored modest amounts of heat during warm periods and released it slowly during cold snaps. The effect was subtle but measurable. Interior temperatures that varied less dramatically and required smaller fires to maintain comfort. Moisture management proved equally important as temperatures dropped toward winter's serious cold. Lacroix's lime sand wash shed rain and snow before they could penetrate the clay moss pack, while his 18-inch gravel skirt prevented capillary rise that could saturate the thermal barrier from below. The vertical posts remained dry and stable, maintaining their structural integrity and thermal performance through freeze-thaw cycles that caused horizontal logs to check and gap. Foster's measurements through late November and early December documented performance differences that had practical implications for fuel consumption and daily comfort. With a modest fire, one 18-inch armload of oak per hour, Lacroix's modified cabin maintained evening interior temperatures of 56 to 60 degrees when outside readings showed 10 degrees above zero. Foster's cabin, burning identical fuel loads under the same conditions, struggled to reach 40 degrees and couldn't maintain that temperature without constant attention to the fire. The neighbor who lived closest to both cabins, a Métis carpenter named Baptiste Dubois, conducted his own informal tests using smoke to visualize air movement. A handful of damp leaves thrown on banked coals produced enough smoke to reveal draft patterns that were invisible under normal conditions. At Foster's cabin, smoke was drawn toward walls, windows, and door frames, indicating negative pressure that pulled cold air into the interior through every available gap. At Lacroix's cabin, smoke rose straight up and dispersed evenly, showing minimal infiltration and balanced air pressure. Word of these findings traveled through the settlement with the kind of skeptical curiosity that frontier communities brought to any claim that challenged established practice. Men who had built dozens of cabins using proven methods were reluctant to believe that a wall fence could outperform traditional construction by such dramatic margins. Some attributed the differences to measurement error or seasonal variation. Others suggested that Lacroix's original cabin had been unusually tight to begin with, making the comparison invalid, but the approaching winter would test more than theories and measurements. Weather reports from railroad stations to the south, carried warnings of an unusual weather pattern developing across the northern plains. High-pressure systems stalling over Canada, while low pressure tracked repeatedly across the Dakotas and Minnesota. The combination promised sustained cold, heavy snow and winds that would find every weakness in every structure across the frontier. December 1886 was shaping up to become the kind of winter that separated adequate preparations from survival necessities, and Pierre Lacroix's wall fence was about to face its definitive examination. The blizzard announced itself on December 15th with a temperature drop that fell 20 degrees in 4 hours, followed by winds that built steadily from 15 miles per hour at sunset to sustained 35-mile-per-hour gusts by midnight. What began as routine December weather became something far more serious when the storm stalled over the northern plains instead of moving through. For 10 consecutive days, the settlement endured conditions that would later be recorded as the opening phase of the Great Die-Up winter. Temperatures that bottomed out at 28 degrees below zero, sustained winds that never dropped below 20 miles per hour, and snowfall that accumulated faster than it could drift away. Samuel Foster had prepared for the test by rationing fuel to create a fair comparison between his cabin and Pierre Lacroix's modified structure. Both men agreed to burn no more than 3/4 of a cord per month, using mixed oak and cottonwood cut to 16 to 18-inch lengths that would fit their fireboxes without waste. The fuel came from the same deadfall grove, split by the same men, and seasoned in the same woodlot. Foster maintained his thermometer log with scientific precision, recording interior temperatures at midnight and dawn, noting wind conditions and fuel consumption with the thoroughness of a man whose skepticism demanded proof. The first night of serious cold provided data that surprised even Foster, who had expected some advantage for the modified cabin, but nothing approaching the measured differences. Outside temperatures reached 28 degrees below zero, with sustained 25-mile-per-hour winds that drove snow horizontally across the prairie. Foster's cabin, with his stove running on low and burning one 18-inch oak split per hour, maintained 30 degrees at midnight and dropped to 23 degrees by dawn. Ice formed on his interior, chinking despite the fire, and his floor thermometer registered 26 degrees near the outside wall, cold enough that stored potatoes would have frozen solid. Pierre Lacroix's modified cabin, burning identical fuel under the same conditions, held 47 degrees at midnight and 44 degrees at dawn. His floor edge temperature remained at 40 degrees throughout the night, and no ice formed on any interior surface. The difference was 21 to 24 degrees warmer throughout the night, a gap that represented the distinction between uncomfortable survival and genuine warmth. More importantly, the modified cabin achieved this performance while consuming the same amount of firewood that left Foster's cabin barely above freezing. The 10-day storm sequence that followed provided an extended test under conditions that pushed both structures to their limits. Foster tracked fuel consumption with the precision of a man whose winter survival depended on accurate accounting. His cabin burned approximately 4/10 of a cord during the storm period, requiring constant attention to maintain even marginal interior temperatures. Loading the firebox every 2 hours became necessary when winds exceeded 30 miles per hour, and even then, dawn temperatures dropped into the low 20s on the worst nights. Lacroix's fuel consumption during the same period totaled approximately 24/100 of a cord, a savings of 40% for dramatically superior comfort. The modified cabin's thermal stability meant that fires could be banked longer and loaded less frequently. Where Foster needed to wake twice each night to add fuel, Lacroix slept through with a single evening loading that carried him to dawn. The mathematics of fuel efficiency translated directly into labor savings, sleep quality, and the kind of margin that could determine survival during extended cold periods. The broader implications became apparent as the storm continued. Henrik Olsen reported white fingers from frostbite after his cabin temperatures dropped into the teens during the coldest night. Thomas Miller lost calves when his barn temperatures fell below the survival threshold for newborn livestock, with losses he estimated at 30% of his winter calf crop. Samuel Foster himself suffered minor frostbite on his feet. During the night, his cabin floor temperatures dropped to 26 degrees, despite wearing wool socks and boots to bed. The Lacroix family emerged from the same storm period with no frostbite incidents and no health complications related to cold exposure. Their stored potatoes remained unfrozen throughout the crisis, with bin temperatures holding between 36 and 38 degrees in an unheated root cellar that adjoined the main cabin. The potatoes represented more than convenience. They were a critical vitamin source that could prevent scurvy during the months when fresh vegetables were unavailable. The ability to store them successfully through extended cold periods provided a nutritional advantage that complemented the thermal benefits of the modified cabin design. Wind effects became increasingly obvious as the storm progressed, and neighboring cabins showed signs of structural stress from repeated pressure cycling. Foster's cabin developed new chinking gaps as horizontal logs shifted under thermal expansion and wind load, requiring daily maintenance to prevent drafts from becoming serious heat loss problems. The constant pressure and release cycle as gusts struck and subsided gradually loosened mud daubing and opened seams that had been tight at the beginning of the storm. Lacroix's palisade system distributed wind loads across multiple vertical posts rather than concentrating stress on horizontal joints, and the continuous earth moss packing moved as a unit without developing discrete failure points. The outer posts absorbed and deflected wind energy before it could reach the inner cabin walls, and the flexible clay moss pack accommodated minor movement without cracking or pulling away from the timber framework. The settlement's general store, run by a German immigrant named Wilhelm Brenner, who served as unofficial record keeper for the community, documented the broader impact of the December storm through his sales ledger and temperature records. Brenner tracked lamp oil consumption, which increased dramatically as families struggled to supplement inadequate heating with additional light sources that threw modest heat. He noted medical visits for frostbite treatment and recorded the dates when neighbors requested credit for additional firewood beyond their normal winter provisions. By Christmas Day, when the storm finally broke and temperatures moderated to 10 degrees below zero with light winds, the performance difference between conventional and modified cabin construction had been documented under conditions severe enough to provide definitive data. Foster's measurements showed that the wall fence concept had delivered exactly what Pierre Lacroix had promised: substantial fuel savings combined with interior temperatures that remained comfortable rather than merely survivable throughout the worst weather the northern plains could deliver. The morning after Christmas brought Samuel Foster to Pierre Lacroix's door with a hatchet over his shoulder and genuine humility in his voice. The same man who had called the wall fence a waste of time and money now asked for the lime recipe and post-spacing measurements. Foster's request marked the beginning of a quiet turnabout that would spread through the settlement without fanfare or dramatic announcements. Neighbors simply appeared with tools and questions, drawn by the undeniable evidence of measured temperature differences and fuel savings that could mean the difference between comfort and suffering through the remaining winter months. Lacroix responded to these requests by handing out practical information rather than satisfaction at being proven right. He understood that frontier survival depended on shared knowledge, and that winter was far from over for any of them. The retrofit process he outlined was straightforward enough for competent men to complete, but it required attention to details that could make the difference between success and expensive failure. The layout process began with snapping a chalk line 12 to 14 inches from the existing cabin walls, depending on available space and the builder's assessment of wind exposure. Lacroix recommended the wider spacing for cabins that faced prevailing northwest winds directly, and the narrower spacing for structures with some natural windbreak protection. Corner returns required careful squaring to ensure the palisade enclosed the cabin completely without gaps that could channel wind into the thermal barrier system. Post selection demanded more care than most settlers initially realized. Straight timber 6 to 8 inches in diameter worked best, with tamarack or oak preferred for their rot resistance and structural stability. Each post needed to be set 30 to 36 inches deep, depending on local frostline conditions, and tamped with clay and stone to prevent settling that could compromise the continuous infill later. Center-to-center spacing of 12 to 14 inches provided optimal support for the packed earth moss barrier while using reasonable quantities of timber. The drainage foundation represented a critical step that many frontier builders overlooked in their hurry to complete visible progress. Lacroix specified an 18-inch gravel skirt around the entire perimeter sloped at half an inch per foot to carry water away from the post line and prevent capillary rise that could saturate the thermal barrier from below. Men who had built dozens of cabins without considering foundation drainage found themselves learning techniques that trading post carpenters had used for decades in wet climates. Infill work required patience that tested men accustomed to measuring progress by linear feet of wall completed per day. The clay moss pack went in using lifts of 3 to 4 inches at a time, mixed in proportions of 2 parts clay to 1 part moss, or 3 parts clay to 1 part chopped straw when moss became scarce during winter months. Each lift required tamping to refusal, the point where the ram rang solid against packed material, before adding the next layer. Rushing this process created settling problems and thermal gaps that defeated the entire system. Door and window openings demanded special attention to maintain the continuous thermal barrier while accommodating the structural movement that occurred in frontier buildings. Lacroix formed plank bucks that created neat U-shaped returns, leaving a 1-inch compressible joint packed with dry moss and over-troweled with half an inch of clay. This detail accommodated seasonal expansion and contraction while maintaining the air seal that made the system effective. The finish work involved mixing lime sand wash in a ratio of 1 part lime to 3 parts sand, creating a weather-shedding surface that protected the clay moss pack from rain and wind erosion. The lime wash required annual maintenance. Spring recoating became part of the seasonal routine, but it prevented the kind of gradual deterioration that could compromise thermal performance over multiple years of frontier weather exposure. Thomas Muller became the first neighbor to complete a retrofit, finishing his palisade installation in 6 days with help from his teenage sons and Baptiste Dubois, the Métis carpenter who had advised Lacroix on the original construction. Muller's German-Russian background included experience with clay plasters and earthen construction techniques, which translated well to the packed infill requirements. His methodical approach and attention to drainage details produced results that validated the retrofit concept under practical field conditions. The following cold snap provided immediate confirmation of the system's effectiveness. Muller reported dawn temperatures 18 to 22 degrees higher than his cabin had achieved before the modification, using the same fuel loads and burning patterns he had established during previous winters. His season total firewood consumption dropped from approximately 3.5 cords to 2 1/10 cords, a 40% reduction that represented substantial savings in cutting labor, hauling time, and cash outlay for purchased fuel. Henrik Olsen completed his retrofit in 9 days, working alone except for occasional help from neighbors who contributed labor in exchange for learning the techniques firsthand. Olsen's innovation involved extending the vertical post concept to create a lee-side warm pen for his calves, using spare posts and moss clay wattle construction to provide wind protection for vulnerable livestock. The livestock application proved as effective as the cabin modification, with calf losses during subsequent cold periods dropping from approximately 30% to 12%. Wilhelm Brenner, the storekeeper who had documented the December storm's impact, tracked the community's adoption of palisade construction through his sales records of lime, nails, and gravel hauling services. His ledger showed 5 cabins modified by the end of January 1887, with material costs averaging $6 to $7 per installation, a reasonable investment that paid for itself in fuel savings within a single season. The spring thaw provided the final validation of construction quality, when thermal cycling revealed the durability differences between conventional and modified cabin systems. Foster's horizontal log cabin showed fresh checking in multiple locations where repeated freeze-thaw cycles had stressed the timber, requiring extensive recalking and chinking repair. The modified cabins showed no new gaps or thermal failures, with floor edge temperatures remaining above 36 degrees throughout the March thaw period, when conventional cabins struggled to stay warm during cool nights. Baptiste Dubois, whose knowledge of French colonial palisade techniques had informed the original design, found himself teaching the system to men who had initially dismissed vertical post construction as primitive. His role evolved from occasional advisor to acknowledged expert in a building method that combined traditional knowledge with frontier materials and climate requirements. The quiet spread of his techniques represented a victory for practical wisdom over conventional assumptions about proper construction methods. By the winter of 1887 to 1888, 5 cabins in the settlement had acquired palisade shells, and the technique was spreading beyond residential construction into practical applications that demonstrated the versatility of continuous thermal barriers. Henrik Olsen's success with livestock protection had inspired similar installations at 3 other farmsteads, where settlers discovered that the same principles that kept cabins warm could create microclimates that improved animal survival rates during extreme weather events. The adoption curve followed practical rather than theoretical lines. Men who had witnessed measured temperature differences and documented fuel savings during the previous winter's crisis were willing to invest the time and materials required for retrofit work. Those who had not experienced the system firsthand remained skeptical, creating a community divided between early adopters who understood the thermal dynamics and traditional builders who trusted conventional methods that had served their fathers adequately. Thomas Muller's livestock applications proved particularly innovative and influential. After observing how his modified cabin created a lee-side warming effect, he constructed a series of connected wind baffles using the same vertical post and packed earth technique around his barn and feeding areas. The result was a microclimate that reduced wind exposure for his cattle during feeding times and created shelter areas where calves could survive temperature extremes that had previously caused significant losses. Muller's detailed records showed calf mortality dropping from 30% during the previous winter to 12% after installing the wind baffle system. The improvement translated directly into increased income from livestock sales, making the palisade technique profitable beyond its fuel-saving benefits. Other stockmen in the region began visiting Muller's operation to study the construction methods and evaluate their potential application to different terrain and building configurations. The spring thaw of 1887 provided a durability test that validated the long-term performance of palisade construction under seasonal weather cycling. Samuel Foster's horizontal log cabin required extensive maintenance after the harsh winter, with new gaps appearing where thermal expansion and contraction had stressed the timber joints. His chinking needed complete replacement in several areas, and 2 logs showed checking severe enough to require caulking with oakum and tar to maintain weather resistance. The modified cabins emerged from the same thermal stress with minimal maintenance requirements. The continuous clay moss packing had moved as a unit during freeze-thaw cycles, maintaining its thermal integrity without developing discrete failure points. Interior wall surfaces showed no frost damage, and floor edge temperatures remained above 36 degrees throughout the March temperature swings that left conventional cabins struggling with cold drafts and condensation problems. Wilhelm Brenner's store records documented the broader economic impact of palisade adoption through reduced fuel purchases and increased demand for lime and construction materials. Families with modified cabins consistently purchased 30 to 40% less firewood during the 1887 to 1888 heating season, freeing up cash for other necessities and reducing the labor burden of fuel preparation and hauling. The materials cost of palisade construction, typically $6 to $8 per cabin, paid for itself within a single winter through fuel savings alone. The technique began attracting attention beyond the immediate settlement as word spread through the network of traders, freighters, and seasonal workers who moved information across the northern plains. Baptiste Dubois found himself teaching palisade construction to men from settlements 30 and 40 miles away, where similar climate conditions made the technique applicable to existing cabin stock and new construction projects. Regional fit became apparent as the method proved adaptable to different timber resources and local materials. Settlers in oak-rich areas used oak posts, while those near pine forests adapted the technique to available softwoods with appropriate adjustments to post diameter and spacing. Clay quality varied by location, but the basic mixture ratios remained consistent, and alternative binders like chopped straw or dried grass provided adequate substitutes where moss was scarce. James Crawford, a contract carpenter who built bridges and schools for the county, began incorporating wind baffle principles into public building specifications after observing the fuel savings achieved by modified cabins. His documentation of palisade techniques in township work notes represented the transition from individual innovation to accepted regional practice, providing detailed construction guidance that standardized the method for use by other builders. Crawford's school building applications proved particularly successful in reducing heating costs for rural districts that struggled to maintain comfortable temperatures in single-room schoolhouses during winter months. A modified school shed in the township southeast of the settlement achieved heating cost reductions of approximately 45% while maintaining interior temperatures adequate for student comfort during the coldest weather periods. The historical context of French colonial palisade construction provided validation for techniques that American frontier builders had initially dismissed as foreign and impractical. Research into trading post records and military construction documents revealed that vertical post techniques with earth moss infill had been used successfully throughout the Great Lakes region and Mississippi Valley for more than a century before Pierre Lacroix applied them to civilian cabin construction on the northern plains. British American frontier traditions had favored horizontal log construction for speed and familiarity. But this preference had created a regional building culture that prioritized rapid construction over thermal efficiency. The success of Lacroix's modification demonstrated that blending construction traditions could produce superior results when environmental conditions demanded maximum thermal performance from available materials and labor resources. Fur trade personnel, including French-Canadian voyageurs and Métis craftsmen, had maintained knowledge of vertical post techniques throughout the American territorial period, but this knowledge had rarely transferred to permanent settlement construction until individual innovators like Lacroix and advisors like Baptiste Dubois demonstrated practical applications under frontier conditions. The Great Die-Up Winter provided the environmental pressure necessary to overcome cultural preferences for familiar building methods. Modern analysis would recognize Lacroix's wall fence as an early example of continuous insulation combined with air sealing and wind baffling, principles that would not become standard in American residential construction for another century. The measured 24-degree interior temperature advantage and 40% fuel savings documented during the 1886 to 1887 winter represented thermal performance that exceeded most frontier construction by margins that determined survival rather than mere comfort during extreme weather events. The final lesson that emerged from the Palisade experiments was elegantly practical. On the northern plains frontier, the man who planned for wind pressure and built continuous barriers against it burned substantially less wood, maintained warmer living conditions, and created margins of safety that proved decisive when environmental conditions exceeded normal seasonal parameters. The technique that neighbors had initially mocked as building a fort around a house had demonstrated its worth through measured results that could not be dismissed or explained away by conventional frontier building wisdom.